The duration of Jesus' public mission was some 2 or 3 years. He spent the majority of that brief time preaching in the northerly region of Galilee and its territories nearby. Occasionally he visited Jerusalem and its surroundings, especially for the Jewish pilgrim feasts. But opposition from the authorities meant that it was dangerous for him to spend much time in Judea or Jerusalem. There has developed in some quarters a romantic picture of Jesus as a wandering rabbi traveling from town to town in haphazard fashion, preaching an idealistic message, stirring hearts and minds, and then moving on, eventually somehow finding himself in Jerusalem, where he ran into serious trouble. But the reality was quite different. Jesus was following a careful plan of action. He was purposeful and strategic in all that he did. Among the many human talents he displayed, Jesus was an excellent organizer who knew what was required to establish a society that would be effective for his messianic mission and that would endure through time. The gospel accounts do not give much space to what might be called the organizational and strategic side of Jesus' activity, probably because it was evident and taken for granted by the early believers who wrote and passed on the accounts. But they do give us certain details that allow us a glimpse of the significant level of planning and organization that lay behind Jesus' mission. A few examples of that gift in action can help fill in the picture. As Jesus went from place to place preaching, he typically brought with him a substantial company. The 12 apostles were present, along with other disciples. A group of women handled food preparation and other material needs, among them, notably, the wife of King Herod's steward. The exact number of this ordered traveling company is not given, but it was at least a few dozen, and seems often to have been many more. Its members would all need to have been fed, clothed, and housed as they went along. There were no signs of vague disorder in their life together. All was well planned and well managed. Jesus set up his base of operations in Galilee, apparently in the town of Capernaum, the village called in the Gospels his home. He and the members of his company regularly set out and returned again to this base camp as the campaign unfolded. The 12 apostles were given specific tasks for the common effort. Peter occupied a position of leadership among them. Along with him, James and John seemed to have special roles, and they accompanied Jesus at important times. We are told that Judas was the treasurer of the company. At one point, Philip and Andrew were approached by some men who wanted to speak with Jesus. The 2 apostles, acting as attendants upon a king, dealing with those seeking an audience. At a certain stage in the campaign, we are told that 70 men were tasked with preaching the gospel 2 by 2 in the towns Jesus was planning to visit. These men would have had to be identified, initiated into the company, and trained. Each of the 35 pairs would have had specific marching orders. It was evident that Jesus had a predetermined strategy for his preaching mission. Anyone who has ever been responsible for this kind of coordinated activity knows how much planning had to go into the effort. When Jesus performed the wilderness miracle of feeding the 5,000, the account notes that he had all the men seated in groups of 50 before feeding them. This was Israelite battle array, and bringing a crowd of thousands into that kind of order would have been no simple task. It would have demanded careful coordination and management. Part of the stiff opposition Jesus provoked arose from the realization that he was putting together an effective movement imbued with clarity of purpose and a plan of action. Solitary and dreamy figures are easily dealt with and easily defeated, but well-connected and well-organized bodies under the leadership of a dynamic personality can pose a serious threat. The followers of Jesus and his enemies knew that all this planning and preparation in a messianic key portended something significant, probably a coming march on Jerusalem when the Messianic kingdom would be definitively proclaimed. What might happen then was anyone's guess, but it would certainly mean something dramatic. An interesting episode involving two of the 12 apostles, James and John, throws additional light on the atmosphere among the company surrounding Jesus. As they saw the careful preparations, the training of disciples, Jesus' growing reputation, his sure grasp of his own strategy, and the heightened anticipation of coming events, these two sons of thunder approached their sovereign in exile with a special request. When you come into your kingdom, grant that we may sit at your right hand and at your left. In other words, we see you are about to make your decisive move. We would like to be Prime Minister and Secretary of State in the powerful kingdom you are about to establish. When the other apostles heard of the request, they were indignant at the two brothers for stealing a march on them. Some of them were apparently harboring similar ambitions, and it became the occasion for a salutary teaching from Jesus about authority. Those who wished to be great, a desire Jesus wanted his disciples to possess, needed to understand what true greatness really meant. It was not in being top dog, but in taking the lowest place and in serving the rest, just as he, the master and king, was serving those he was leading. The episode also showed how inadequate the disciples' understanding was of the kind of kingdom Jesus planned to establish. To help prepare them for what was coming, Jesus began to warn them of the necessary path he was going to follow if his enemies were to be conquered and his reign brought about. He spoke of being taken prisoner and being put to death. He alluded mysteriously to rising from the dead. None of this made sense to them. Despite having heard his teaching, they had not yet grasped the fundamentally spiritual nature of his kingdom, and the idea that the Messiah would not conquer his enemies, but be conquered by them, ran counter to all their expectations. At one point, in order to steel them for coming events, Jesus took the leaders among them, Peter, James, and John, up a mountain, and there he allowed them to encounter something of his real identity. He was seen by them in conversation with Moses and Elijah, revealing himself as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, and about to inaugurate a new exodus. The disciples were shown a glimpse of his divinity shining through his humanity, and they were overwhelmed and dazzled by the glory of it. Finally, the anticipated event was announced to the company. Jesus was to march on Jerusalem. Thomas, the most hard-headedly realistic among the disciples, saw something of the likely consequences. "Let us go and die with him," was his expression of loyalty. The Passover feast was coming, and tens of thousands of pilgrims were streaming into the holy city. The Romans, always fearing unrest at these pilgrim feasts, when the city was filled to overflowing with zealous men, had stationed an extra cohort of soldiers at their fortress adjoining the Jewish temple. All eyes were on Jesus. Everywhere people were wondering, is he really the Messiah? Will he come to the feast? If he does come, will he attempt to take the city and establish himself as king? The crowds were restless and wondering. The temple authorities were troubled and fearful. The Romans were watchful and wary. The disciples were filled with conflicting presentiments, knowing that the next few weeks would prove the crisis point for their beloved master and the success or failure of the movement upon which they had staked their lives. Into this maelstrom of hope, anxiety, fear, calculations of power, and dreams of glory, among a seething and incendiary pilgrim crowd, came Jesus, riding into Jerusalem on a royal mount like a returning monarch, with some among the populace doing him homage, shouting his praise and proclaiming him the Son of David, the long-desired king now coming into his inheritance. The city was stirred to its depths. All wondered what the next few days might bring.